Hi guys! In this video, I'll be covering my pull plans in DFFOO Global in the upcoming arc where Minwu will be newly released and his FRBT will be featured as well. As always, you can refer to the cropped infographic, and I will also be including a link to the full infographic in the video description, which was actually derived from the thewereotter's global forecast, so do check that out if you want further information on upcoming events. Looking back at the last arc, which was Rinoa's FRBT arc, this was the arc where I had a ton of tickets about to expire, so I really had to use my tickets. I went in deep in Rinoa's banner with tickets, and 220 tickets was actually a very lucky pull for me because in that 220 tickets I actually snagged 4 copies of Rinoa's FR, but unfortunately did not snag her BT weapon there. So upon some thinking and deliberating, I decided to just go in on Ares banner, which I originally wanted to skip. Main reason is just that I didn't really feel like I want to use my BT tokens, and I couldn't wait for Baldur's event to drop, so I decided to instead go in deep with tickets one more time on Ares' banner. I spent 570 tickets there, and in that 570 tickets I snagged 2 copies of Ares' FR and luckily Rinoa's BT weapon as well. I really didn't have much of a choice because that 790 tickets were about to expire in my inbox and would have expired within that arc if I had not used them. All in all, I think it's a big win because I only had to spend 790 tickets before I scored Rinoa's BT, and I got 6 FR weapons on the way, which saves me a ton of high power stones as well. As for the other events, Baltier and Ardine's banner, considering that I used quite a lot of tickets already and the rest of my tickets still had a little bit of time left in their expiry date, I decided to just skip the other event banners. Alright, coming to Act 3 Chapter 10.1, which will be coming out in a couple of days time from the making of this video. I am actually quite excited for this event because Minwu will be newly released here, and I did a little bit of reading around Minwu's kit, and I have to say his kit, it looks to be quite a fun kit overall. Minwu is a holy magic DPS, and most of his damage is actually centered around his holy anchor trap. However, something that sets him apart from other trap characters is that he can actually trigger his trap anytime he attacks, and depending on what weapons you actually have ML beat, he can even refresh the duration on his traps as well, meaning that although a significant portion of his damage comes from his traps activating, you don't really have to wait for the enemies to take turns. You can actually activate the traps during Minwu's turn as well. To get most out of his kit, you really do need Minwu's LD. When you use his LD, you will refresh all traps on all enemies to the maximum duration, which is 6 turns. His LD also gives him a new stacking overhead that maxes out at 5 stacks and increases by 1 stack anytime Minwu attacks. When the overhead reaches 5 stacks, it will trigger an additional attack, and this attack will also refresh all the traps back to 6 turns again, and his overhead will then reset back to 1 stack. In a way, what you're trying to do with Minwu is to continuously trigger the traps, and the traps will trigger his overhead or increase the stacks on his overhead, and his overhead will trigger the traps and refresh the trap duration. The overhead increasing stack by 1 will go off anytime Minwu attacks, and this also counts in Minwu's traps as well. So if Minwu does a regular attack, it will increase the stack by 1, and if that regular attack triggers the trap, it will increase the stack by another 1. So if done correctly, you should be able to continuously trigger and refresh the traps before they fall off on the enemies. His BT aura really kicks things up an additional notch. First off, it does have the usual nice juicy boosts to offensive stats that you do see in quite a number of BT weapons. But what is really nice about Minwu's BT aura is that it now causes him to trigger his traps twice each time he attacks. As you can imagine, this is a significant DPS increase to Minwu's overall kit, which also means that if you want to effectively use Minwu as a DPS character, yes, he can of course work without his PT weapon, but you really do want his PT weapon because it is a significant jump overall. Minwu's FR is another FR that focuses on off-turn damage, and I must say that I like those kind of FRs. If you have pulled and tried other FRs such as Core or Ferris, then you probably would have some experience already and you would see how powerful those can be with the right party composition. First off, Minwu's force bonus starts at 150% instead of the usual 120%, and anytime your party does a holy damage attack, including off-turn attacks, this will increase the bonus by 5%, which is pretty typical for off-turn bonus increases. And anytime you do any sort of follow-up attack, you will trigger another plus 5%. Now these are the only bonus increases, and it might seem like a pretty small increase because it's just plus 5% and plus 5%, but you have to keep in mind that Minwu triggers his traps pretty often overall, and his traps are considered a holy damage attack and also a follow-up attack, so which means that each time Minwu triggers his traps it will be 10%, and he can actually trigger his traps twice per turn, so just his traps alone, not counting his regular attack and not counting any other characters in your party that can do off-turn damage, just his traps alone will give you a 20% increase. Overall, in my opinion, Minwu is one of those DPS characters that has the potential to really be busted, but because his FR focuses a lot on off-turn and follow-up attacks, he really shines the most when you try to put him as a center piece of your party and build around his FR and his trap attacks. With regards to the other characters featured on the two banners, we have Cisne and Vanille on one banner, and then we have Locke, Shadow and Nine appearing on the second banner. Cisne is still, I guess, quite a decent off-turn damage dealer. She follow-up attacks anytime after your character does any attack. The main drawback though is that her on-turn damage is kind of bad, and by now most people will actually just use Kayn as their follow-up attacker of choice anyway. As for Vanille, she does have the Dispel utility and she can land a very nice defense down debuff, but at this point of the game so can many other characters, so there's really nothing that sets Vanille apart from other characters. But if you're lacking an LD call that can Dispel, then certainly Vanille LD can at least provide you that utility. Locke BT used to be pretty decent back in the day because his BT aura provides your party with the ignore defense passive. However, sadly I don't think he's worth chasing now because there are many other DPS characters that will probably do a better job than him, and the ignore defense isn't actually very valuable now late in the C90 era, because when characters receive their C90 boosts they get a hefty increase in brave damage done, so in most cases you should have very little trouble capping your brave damage anyway. Shadow is a range damage dealer that specializes in defense ignoring as well. And Nine finally is a DPS character with a little bit of added utility in that he can provide your party with brave shields similar to Warrior of Light, and he does have the ability through his LD to negate one incoming HP attack. Overall, my plans here is actually going in deep for Minwu. I would have used gems, except that coming to this event I will have tickets expiring in another 10 days because I haven't used any tickets since Baltier event, so I'll probably throw a bunch of tickets here. Whether or not I'll use gems, I guess depends on how I do with my tickets. I'll probably spend a few hundred tickets and see how I do. and I may just hold off the rest until Hope's banner come around. Next up is Vaan's Intersecting Wheels, featuring the return of Vaan up to his BT, and this time Vaan's FR is also going to be newly released. Vaan's rework allows both his S1 and S2 to trigger the second attack immediately, and it converts to the plus version after just one use, which is quite a good improvement to his kit. His LD and EX remains, I believe, largely unchanged from the current version, but he doesn't actually require a lot of changes anyway because he did already receive his C90 boost and rework not too long ago. Vaan is actually a pretty competent magical DPS dealer, damage dealer, and I have to say that, you know, if you have skipped Tifa and Rinoa for some reason, Vaan is actually pretty okay. The biggest drawback, I guess, for Vaan is really the timing of his release, because we've had a slew of damage dealers released very recently that vies for top spot in the DPS charts, and if you have Tifa plus minus Rinoa already, there's really not a lot of reasons to go for Vaan, mainly because that if you really want to use Vaan, you do also want to consider investing BT ingots in him, and even fully realize he would have a difficult time matching up to Rinoa, which is currently the queen sitting at the top of the DPS charts. His FR is pretty good, especially for himself. I guess similar in a way in how Rinoa's FR is also pretty good for herself. When he uses his FR, it gives him his LD buff immediately, which grants him the free skill users. Immediately after that, his allies also get 2 free skill users, so even if Vaan cannot monopolize all the turns during force time, his allies would still be able to fulfill the conditionals and increase the force bonus accordingly. The force bonus is when a character uses a free skill attack, you get a plus 40%. When Vaan himself does a free skill attack, he gets another 20% for a total of 60% just by using a free skill use. If you end your turn with at least 20% of your max brave, you get another 20%. Vaan himself does have a brave floor effect, so he should have no problems meeting this criteria or conditional as well. So meaning that on Vaan's turn, if you use his S1 or S2 when it's a free skill use, you should consistently get at least 80% increase to the force bonus. In addition, Vaan's FR effect also gives free skills an additional 20% boost to HP damage done and an increase in brave and HP damage cap by 20%, which is pretty nice and stacks with any other auras or effects that you may have going on at the same time. I guess the only somewhat other notable character on the banners here is H, and H has been released quite some time ago around the end of the Lufenia Plus era, right before Shinryu era started. And H by himself is still pretty okay even in today's standards, because he does provide the party with 100% evasion through his EX, and he does have the gimmick where he can counter attack any attacks that he evades. So in a nutshell, you can also use H in a counter attack often damage strategy if you really want to, but he will of course be competing with a few other characters who can also fulfill at least the often damage role pretty well. My plan here is to skip. Main reason is that I don't actually have Vaan's BT, and in this arc I am already going for Minwu's BT. It seems pretty high investment to actually try to chase 2 BTs in one arc, and especially considering that I do need to spend 6 BT ingots to fully MLB both BTs, so thanks but no thanks. The third event in this arc, which is Act 3 Chapter 10.2, would be an event that many characters are hyped up for, because this event features the return of Hope in the banner, and he's hyped not because he's returning in the storyline, but more because his FR and his rework is actually pretty good as a force gauge charger. He will sort of replace Iroha and Ursula as your sort of generalist FR. With regards to his work, I think something quite notable beyond the usual damage increases and more HP dumps is that his protect is now instant turn, which makes it so that both his S1, S2, shell and protect are going to be instant turn abilities. And since those attacks don't do any damage, that means that they can function as your force gauge charger. Hope's FR is probably going to be one of the best, if not the best, generalist FR in terms of the conditionals. So when he uses his FR, he gets the physical and magical damage resist plus 60%, which is essentially his protect and shell together. He also buffs the party with speed plus 35%, inflicts his LD D-shell debuff on all enemies, and recover one use of his S1 and S2 and is instant turn. The last part is pretty crucial, I would say, because his FR being instant turn means that immediately after popping FR, you can then spam his shell and protect to supercharge his own FR meter pretty quickly. And his FR kit actually helps you to do that because it refunds one skill use of his shell and protect. The force conditionals are when a player batteries and allies and both his S1 and S2 does that, you get a 20% increase. When Hope batteries the allies, you get another 20% for a total of 40%. And if you end your turn with party buffs totaling 13 or more, you get an additional 30%. The last conditional shouldn't be too hard to achieve because Hope by himself can buff shell and protect on the entire party, and that equates to 6 buffs in a 3-man party. This means that during Hope's FR, when he does shell and protect, you will meet all 3 conditionals for 70% increase, and because shell and protect are again instant turn abilities that do not do any damage, assuming you have invested in Hope's FR levels, you should get another plus 50% to the force conditionals for a grand total of 120% per use of shell or protect. So just spending 4 or 5 turns spamming shell or protect will quickly charge the force bonus to like 6 to 700%, and you can then follow up with some shenanigans like using Anacrow LD to quickly annihilate the enemies on the field. Even if you don't plan to abuse this, Hope using his FR and just using like 3 users of shell or protect will already provide a hefty increase in the force bonus, and you can then just have another character take over after his turn to quickly deal some nice damage to the bosses. The one drawback I guess about Hope only is that he does buff the party with shell and protect, which are framed buffs, and they aren't that bad as a buff because they do mitigate quite a lot of brave damage, but in a no boss turn run you don't actually need to do that. And you can run into situations where you actually fill up your party 6 buff slots to the max, and you may not be able to then depend on other frame buffs that you may actually want over shell and protect. That being said, I think just on the virtue that Hope can quickly charge, or I should say significantly charge up the force gauge bonus on his own, is a pretty good incentive to pull. So overall here, my plan is to just throw a bunch of tickets, hoping to score at least 1 copy of Hope's FR. If I at this point still do not have Minwu's PT, then I may just throw more tickets and hope to get Minwu's PT here as well, while I score more copies of Hope's FR. But if I did already score Minwu's PT earlier, I'll probably just go until I get 1 copy of his FR and use high power stones to max it out, since I have amassed quite a bit since the last arc. Okay, on this part of the video, I'll quickly go through my opinion, and I can't stress that enough, my opinion on characters that I think are going to be worth your gems, tickets and ingots if you are having limited resources. This time around, this part of the video looks pretty scarce, I have to say. Looking through all the characters that will receive reworks and will be re-released here, a lot of them are pretty unnotable. not bad per se. You can actually use them in Shinryu. It's just that in many cases they are outclassed and you would usually not want to bring them in favor of someone else. There are 3 I think that really stands out, and of the 3, 2 of them are actually pretty good in terms of value, and those 2 are Hope and Minwu. Hope, I think, especially if you haven't gotten generalist FRs like Ursula or Iroha, Hope is a fantastic pickup. By himself, he can help you charge your force gauge, his FR, and he can charge his own FR bonus to significant amounts. So there can be strategies involving Hope and his FR that quickly charges up the FR and demolishes the enemies with very hard hitting attacks such as Anacro or Seed Highwind. Minwu is, I think, a little bit more debatable. I actually think that you don't really have to pull for Minwu because he actually comes after Rinoa's arc, and majority of people would have pulled for Rinoa. So if you have like Tifa and Rinoa, you already have 2 super high tier damage dealers anyway that would serve you well in the at least foreseeable future. But I really like Minwu's kit because him triggering his traps means that, you know, he could work in a no boss turn run if you want to, but he could also work in an off turn damage dealing run, focusing around off turn damage and counter attacks as well. Having this versatility, I think, is pretty good for a DPS character, so for that reason I kind of rate him quite highly here. The third character is more in the role fulfillment category, meaning that, you know, if you're really for some reason hurting for a DPS or magical DPS character, then certainly Vaan can fit that role really well, I have to say. But for me, you know, at the point his banner will be released, I would have Tifa, I would have Rinoa, I would probably have Minwu as well. That it's really hard to consider, you know, spending resources for Vaan. I mean, even if I did pull Vaan, how am I going to build a party here? Because, you know, I don't want to build a party of, say, you know, Rinoa plus Vaan. There's really no need. I would rather just bring one of the 2 and fill the rest of the party slots with support or tanks or something like that. So that's it for this video. In summary, I plan to spend quite a lot on my ticket stash for Minwu's FRBT because I do have quite a lot of tickets that will expire soon. I will skip Vaan's banners and I'll probably just throw a bunch of tickets until I score 1 copy of Hope's FR. If you enjoyed the content, do leave a like, comment or subscribe. It really helps a lot. Till then, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!